Good morning. Good morning. We are in for a wonderful morning of ideas and debate and discourse. And we have three exceptional scholars from the American Enterprise Institute. And AEI is one of the really fine institutions in Washington, D.C. It's known as the think tank. And the purpose of a think tank is to wage the battle of ideas, the war of ideas. And the theory is, and it's a very sound theory, that those in government really don't have the time or the comfort of thinking of ideas or doing anything but operational. And so that they have to bring the capital, the intellectual capital, into the office with them when they get there. And the best way to do it is kind of in an academic situation, academic surrounding, but an academic surrounding that is enhanced and furthered by the lack of students in that. So you don't have to grade papers, you don't have to do the same lecture you did before. You can really do your research and you can propagate your ideas as best possible in the environment of Washington. So you have this group of think tanks around Washington that basically come up with ideas, come up with facts and opinions that people in public policy can use. And it really is, it's a system that works out, I think, very, very well. And you have a lot of talent in these think tanks. Much of the talent will go into an administration, like a Brookings talent would go into a Democratic administration because it's generally liberal. An AEI or Heritage think tank would generally go into a Republican administration because it's more conservative. And so these are people brimming with ideas and want to implement them once they get in office. And if you believe, as we do in Aspen, that ideas have consequences, then this is awfully important work. And over the years, I think that few think tanks have done it better than AEI. Arthur Brooks is now in charge of AEI. He's going to speak to us first this morning. AEI has been enormously successful over the years. It now has a budget of $32 million. There are 60 full-time faculty members who are churning out ideas, churning out reports, testifying like mad. It has grown 70% in the last 5 years, which is amazing. Last year they had 6 New York Times bestseller on the list from AEI scholars, including Arthur Brooks' latest book, his 10th book on that. And they have congressional testimony. AEI has done 20% more congressional testimony than any other think tank. And they have churned out op-ed pieces like mad, coming at a clip of about one every 4 days in the Wall Street Journal and Washington Post and the New York Times. So it's an amazing contribution to the war of ideas, or the battle of ideas, or just the propagating of ideas. And I personally believe that politics is all about ideas. And when you have a view like that ideas really do matter enormously, then something like AEI matters enormously. And its president matters enormously. Arthur Brooks has been there for a good number of years, and what is it, about 8 or 9, 8, 5, okay? We strive for accuracy in all presentations. And so 5 years, as I was saying, and took over from Chris DeMuth, who left it in very fine shape, and Arthur has made it in even finer shape. Arthur has a wonderful background. He could have been not here in Pepke, but he could have been over at the music tent because he was a professional French horn player for 12 years of his life in professional orchestras in Annapolis and Barcelona, and then was a lecturer of economics and public policy at Syracuse University. And his area is a fabulous area. You think of AEI as primarily, which it is, on economics, even though it's a lot of foreign policy, but that Arthur has glommed on to a wonderful subject, which is happiness and what makes happiness and what are the elements of happiness. And so besides all the thrust of AEI on anti-regulation, on free enterprise, on less government, etc., he has done made a wonderful contribution on the nature of happiness, which is a subject all of us are quite interested in. So, ladies and gentlemen, we'll start our morning of ideas and discussion with Arthur Brooks.
Thank you, my friend. Good. Thanks. You got my notes there. Where are my notes? They're right here. Okay. Thanks. What a gracious introduction, and it's a delight to see all of you. It's obviously a pleasure to be in Aspen for all sorts of reasons. Just look outside. Maybe you take it for granted. I assure you that I don't. As you heard, that I'm the president of the American Enterprise Institute, a think tank in Washington, engaged in getting better public policy and better culture. Washington is not an easy place to be right now or any time. Think of it, I live in Washington, so you don't have to. I'm not a native to that area. I'm from Seattle, Washington. I'm from the real Washington. And I came to Washington only 5 years ago to run AEI after teaching for a long time at Syracuse University. And when I first got there, it's a tough place, and I sort of had no idea. And my friend and colleague, Peter Wallison, who's first Peter? Peter Wallison is here. Peter lives in Aspen during the summers because he's smart. And when I first got to AEI, Peter said, you're probably getting a lot of advice, on how to make it in Washington, how to run an institution in Washington. It's really in the middle of the political debates. I mean, AEI scholars, we testify more than any other think tank. We write more op-eds in the major papers than any other think tank. We're right in the center of these controversies. I get so much hate mail. It's great. It's really great. So when I first got to Washington, Peter says, if you want one piece of advice from me, and I said, yeah, I mean, you've been in this forever. He said, know who your friends are, right? And I said, that's great advice. How do I know who my friends are? And he thought about it, and he said, they're the ones who stab you in the chest. So that's Washington, D.C. for you. But not to talk about my troubles all morning. We are in the center of this war of ideas, and typically those who come to us, I mean, we're an institution with a very simple mission statement. AEI is a community of scholars and supporters dedicated to the proposition that maximizing liberty, increasing individual opportunity, and fighting for free enterprise gives the most people the best life. Okay? That's a little controversial to some people, not to everybody, but it's really about human flourishing. Okay, now, when you have a mission statement like that, mostly Republican politicians want your advice. Okay, now, I wish that everybody wanted our advice, and I'm procuring to get everybody interested in what we're doing, but it's mostly Republicans who come knocking on the door. In the last year, the main question that we've gotten from Republican policymakers is, what have we been doing wrong? What are we doing wrong? And my answer is basically this. This is what sums up what I think conservatives are doing wrong. You're talking about the wrong thing. What do you mean? Two Republican congressmen are walking down the street in Washington, D.C., best friends. And they walk in front of the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee. Right? And what catches their eye is a sign in the front window that says, become a Democrat today, earn $1,000. Now, one looks at the other and says, is that possible? I mean, could they really be that desperate? I tell you what, go in there and pretend you want to join, right? It'll freak them out, but let's see if they're really up for the money. He says, okay, I'll do it. So his friend walks in, and he's waiting for his friend, and 5 minutes turns to 10, and it turns to 15. He says, that's weird. And so he goes across the street and sits down on a park bench, and he waits, and an hour goes by. Till finally his friend walks out, and he goes running up to him and says, so, what happened? He says, I joined. He said, what do you mean you joined? Yeah, I became a Democrat just now. He says, really? He says, yeah, they convinced me that all my opinions about foreign policy and economics were wrong, So I joined. I'm a Democrat now. He says, huh. Well, did they give you the $1,000? And his friend looks at him with pity and says, is that all you people care about? It doesn't take very much to make people think that conservatives only care about money. only care about material things. But when you ask ordinary Americans, what do you care about most? If I polled you, I know what the answer would be. What do you care about most? What do you want the most? You want happiness. That's what you want. That's what I want. That's what we all want. We want happiness. Now, of course, you can't really study happiness and talk about happiness because it's all subjective, so you study money instead. Wrong. That's wrong. If you want to win the hearts of people, talk about what matters. That's the advice that we give to policymakers today. Talk about the flourishing, the thriving, what's actually going on to give people meaning in their lives, to give them happier lives. What can you do to make more Americans lead happier lives, or at least be able to pursue their happiness more effectively? And that's what I want to talk about. Take a few minutes and talk to you about what we know about that and how we can make it work. Now, I've studied happiness for a long time. When I was an academic, I was at Syracuse. I had an endowed chair, and I was a full professor. You know what that means is I had no adult supervision. I could do anything I want. I had 10 years. Beautiful. And I said, you know, I'm only going to write books about things that I want to know the answers to. They're going to make me a better person and a happier person and a better father and everything else. So I decided to do serious study on the topic of happiness. I read everything on the topic of happiness, every article, every book, so you don't have to. And I'm going to tell you basically what it says, and then I'm going to tell you what I think it means from the perspective of the guy who's in charge of the American Enterprise Institute. So I'm going to tell you, first of all, who's happy. Psychologists for 30 years have been figuring out who's happy and who's not. And you'd think it would be a really complicated thing to do using functional MRI machines or brain scanning technologies or something. One of the things that we know from social science is it's really easy to measure happiness. Large samples of people, anonymously surveyed, you simply have to ask them. Not about how happy you are right now. All things considered in your life, how happy would you say you are? Number 1 is miserable, as miserable you could be. Number 7 is as happy as you could possibly be, in bliss. What's your number? Think of your number right now. The clinical psychologists who study this have found that the number you have in your head right now is surprisingly stable and accurate and probably reflects the truth. How do we know the truth? Because we have studies that looks at the person closest to you, takes them, isolates them, and says, how happy is he or she? So your spouse, how happy would he or she say you are? Your son or daughter, your best friend, how happy are you? Right? What do we know about it? You're thinking a number right now, right? Here's basically what we know. Let's put it into 3 categories. Not happy, very happy, or somewhat happy, okay? About 1/3 of Americans are very happy. This is 6s and 7s. About 50% of Americans are somewhat happy, and 10 to 15% are the chronically depressed minority who say, I'm not happy. That has been stable since the early 1970s. It doesn't matter who gets elected president. It doesn't matter what's going on with the economy for more than about 6 months. Basically, that's a stable phenomenon. Okay, so that's the way it is. People are pretty happy in the United States as a general principle. The interesting question is, what causes it? What can make you jump from one category to another? We know the answer, and I'm going to tell you. There are 3 things, and we know in what percentage will change your happiness today. Okay. The first, the biggest one, is actually the one you can control the least. It's genetics. Now, I don't want this to be true. I don't want your happiness to be a genetic phenomenon, because I'm an American. I want everything to be under our control, right? I want to be the blank slate. This is how we're wired. You know, as an American, you want to believe that you can come from the worst possible family, but if you get a great first grade teacher, it'll be all good, right? Well, psychologists studying identical twins have shown that most of our personality actually is, at least in some part, genetically based. There are researchers at the University of Minnesota who have a database of twins. They have 3,210 pairs of twins that they've established baseline measurements of their personalities at age 40. Okay? Now, this is a great database because it shows people who are really related to each other very closely how their personalities relate to each other. The most interesting subpart of this database are identical twins, DNA carbon copies, who were adopted to separate families at birth, and then at age 40, their personalities are measured. Okay, that's gold, right? Because you know that their nature is identical, but their nurture is different, and using the right statistical tools, we can say what each part of their personality is based on their different environment. Okay, so what do you find? Everything's genetic. 40% of how you vote is genetic. 40% of how religious you are is genetic. The bigger part of your tendency toward alcoholism, your tendency toward neuroticism, your extroversion is genetic. And about half of your happiness. Specifically, 48% of your baseline happiness at any given time, the point at which you tend, is genetic. So, I looked at a lot of studies on this. 48% is a lot, and it's depressing, ironically, and because you can't affect it. And I remember telling my wife, Esther, about this. She reads all my stuff. She spikes my work if it's no good. She's very helpful. And I said, showing this work to Esther, and I said, 48% of my happiness is genetic. And she said, see, it's true. Your mother did make you unhappy, right? Literally. And what that tells us is that some people, have you ever met somebody who's just happy? It's extremely annoying. Somebody that you work with who's just cheerful all the time. It's genetic. It's not just because they're doing something right in their lives. Generally speaking, it's because they have the happy gene. Okay, now, I live with one of them. My wife is one of those people. She's a 6 or a 7. I mean, I'm kind of 4 or 5. I'm a pretty dark. I mean, I'm brooding. I'm a musician. I'm an artist, so I can't help it. But she's one of these super happy people. And you know these people. They're in your lives. They're supposed to bring you up, but they actually bring you down. And I mean, this is an example. We were in December. We were driving home from a particularly bad parent-teacher conference, which some of you have experienced if you have adolescent children like I do. And my son was having this big grades problem in school. And we were in the car, and it was this icy silence, and I'm driving on the way home. And finally, my wife breaks the silence. She says, here's how we need to think about it. At least we know he's not cheating. Right? Yeah, that's a happy person. That's a happy person. Right. As a general principle, related to the genetics of happiness is the innate qualities that people have that makes them happier. Who's happier? Quick trivia quiz. Men or women? Who's happier, men or women? Well, that's pretty universal here in this group. That's actually true. Women are happier, and they're a lot happier. Now, here's a weird phenomenon. Over the past 30 years, women's general happiness has been declining. It's not all the way down to the unhappiness of men, but it's on its way down. Women, you're converging to the unhappiness of your husbands. This is what we find since the early 1970s. Why? I will leave that to you. Right? But generally speaking, you find that that's true. Married women are happier than married men. Single women are happier than single men. Widowed women are way happier than widowed men. I told that to my wife. She said, huh. The only group of men that's happier than women is divorced men. Why? The reason is because divorced women typically get the kids and they're single moms, and that's really stressful and it's no fun. So there's an exogenous explanation for this. Okay, now, here's another quick question that's going to relate to the main point of what I'm going to talk about today. What's the average unhappiest age in a man's life? I know the answer, because I've seen this in studies from the United States going back decades, and I've actually run the numbers myself, using the right econometric analysis myself. I know this is true. There's a distinguishable average unhappiest age in a man's life. When do you think it is? Oh boy, somebody's read my books. So 45 is exactly right. 45 is the distinguishable unhappiest age in a man's life. So why? Puzzling about this. I keep finding this it's one thing to find it in the data, it's something else to find the explanation. So I go to a social psychologist colleague who specializes in happiness, and I say, what's the deal? 45, keep showing up in the data. Why are men unhappy at 45? She says, well, the deal is that there are all of these family explanations, and I get this gobbledygook and social science nonsense. I said, no, cut to the chase. What does this mean? She said, 45 is when your wife figures out definitively that you're boring, right? And that's why men are unhappiest at age 45. And I thought, there's got to be something better. So I looked into the data myself. Here's what's really going on. Ask an economist, we know everything, right? So you look at the data, and the data show that the whole phenomenon of the age 45 problem, the trough, is driven by about half of guys. Half of guys don't have it. Half of guys have a really big problem at age 45. You put them all together, and it looks like there's a kind of a distinguishable moderate trough. It's half of guys have a big problem. What's going on with those half of guys? Here's really what happens, basically. When you're in your early 20s and your 30s, as a man typically, life is simple. You want to have a better life? Hit the gas. Hit the gas on your career. Make more money. Work harder. Do more. And actually, you get happier, it turns out. But something happens. About half of guys get to age 45 and they say, I'm on the wrong road. You know, I'm stuck on the superhighway. I've been hitting the gas this whole time, but I don't want to be on this road. I want to be on that road, that little dirt road. The one with the guy on the motorcycle without the helmet, instead of where I am today. But I can't stop, right? I mean, I'm a lawyer, and I make a lot of money, and I've got the tuition for my kids, and I've got the expensive house payment, and I'm stuck. I don't want to be stuck. Those are the guys that are driving the 45-year-old trough. Okay, now, I got lucky. Pure luck. You heard that I used to have the greatest job ever. Ken told you that I used to be a musician. I was in the Barcelona Symphony. And that's a great job, it sounds like, right? See, I dropped out of college when I was 19. Dropped out, kicked out, splitting hairs, right? and I went on the road as a musician, and I did that for a long time. And I finally got to the point where I was in my late 20s, no college degree, nothing. And I looked around and I looked at my colleagues in the orchestra, and I thought, I don't want to be them. Because they're not happy. And I'm actually less happy than I was 10 years ago, so I'm going to make a change. So I decided to go back to college. I'm living in Barcelona at the time. And I call my dad, and I say, Dad, I got big news. Now, my dad was a college professor at a little liberal arts college. He was a math professor. And I said, Dad, I got big news, good news. I'm going to quit music and go back to college. And he thinks it's a terrible idea. He says, you can't do that. It's totally irresponsible. You have a family. You can't just start again. Who does something like that? Why? And I was ready. I said, Dad, because I'm not happy. Right? There's this long silence. And he says, what makes you so special? Some of you know my dad or somebody just like my dad. So, but I did it, and it was the best thing I ever did because now I'm in the zone. I mean, here's the craziest thing. I'm talking about happiness, and I'm getting paid. It's the craziest thing ever. This is my job. It's the best, and I just happened into it. I stumbled into it. It's a beautiful thing, but not everybody does. Half of the guys never get there. What is it? Here's the question. You're going to get the answer in about 8 minutes. What is it that's on the little road that they want? What is the secret that those guys are looking for when they're 45 and bummed out? What is the thing that they want? We know what it is, and I'm going to tell you what it is. And it's the secret to happiness that I'm telling my kids, and I'm going to tell you, and that we can all enjoy and improve our lives with. But you're going to have to wait because I have to talk about a couple other things first. Okay, genetics, that's number one. Number two is real simple. It's good luck. The second thing that brings your happiness is basic good luck. Now, you know you can affect your luck by doing different things in your lives. How much do temporary circumstances play a role in your happiness at any one time? The answer is a lot. 40% of your happiness at any given one time is circumstances based on big good events or big bad events. Okay, so if you think about that, you think 40%, I should be working for good luck all the time. No, you shouldn't. And here's the paradox. At any particular time, you're being brought up a lot or brought down a lot on the basis of these one-off events, but you really can't affect them very much, and the stuff never lasts. Big one-off events, you know how long they affect your happiness? Max 6 months. Here's the weirdest cognitive problem that we have. The biggest mistake that we make about happiness is supposing that something big is going to make us happy forever or unhappy forever, and it's always wrong. Okay? We have data on people who've moved because they want good weather. They really want good weather. How long does happiness persist from moving to Southern California? We got the data, 6 months. Right? 6 months. Doubling your income. How much does it affect your happiness? 3 months. A new house. 3 months. Okay. researchers at one point actually looked at a large database of people who've been in horrible accidents. Let's look at bad things. Horrible accidents. People who'd lost had lost use of their legs. Okay? Paraplegics. How long are they affected in their unhappiness by this horrible, disfiguring accident that makes them unable to live their lives as they once lived them? 6 months. 6 months. 6 months after an accident in which you become paralyzed, you're back to your old level of happiness. Now, forever, these people say, yeah, I wish I had use of my legs. But their happiness level is where it was before. We're durable. We have a baseline. It's based on the genetics. The one-off stuff doesn't matter. Here's something that really should give us pause, and it's going to make a difference in what our understanding of the topic. Now, what if you won the lottery? I've studied the lottery a lot. Why? Because I'm very interested in poverty. Poverty is one of my main areas of research. I believe I am called as a moral individual to try to serve people who are weaker than I am. I believe my institution exists to fight for people who are weaker than every single one of us in this auditorium. That's my view. And so, what am I going to study? One of the things I'm going to study is people who are in poverty. And one of the things you look at is what people who are in poverty do to try to alleviate their situation or try to make their lives better. And one of the things they do all the time is they go to this wonderful government predatory monopoly called lottery, right? Now, my guess is that none of you bought a scratch off on the way here to this lecture today, right? Just a guess that none of you bought a lottery ticket on the way in here. Poor people buy lottery tickets. That's what's really going on. So, what would you do if you hit the lottery? How good would your life be? This is going to play into this luck phenomenon and how long it lasts, okay? We have the data. We have the data on exactly how this works, right? If you ask people, this is a party game. You want to get to know somebody, you want to see their soul a little bit, go around the room and say, if you hit the lottery, what would you do? Major Powerball lottery, 30 million, just like that. What would you do? People always say the same things. Good things. I would go be around my family. You know, I would finally write the novel I've been trying to work on all these years. I would go someplace warm. When guys are trying to impress girls, you know what they say? They always say this, I'd start a foundation. Right? No, you wouldn't, because I have the data on that too. So, so what really happens? You know, here's something that nobody ever says. You know, if I hit the lottery, you know what I'd do? I think I'd start by buying a bunch of useless junk that I don't need. And then I think I'd get involved romantically in a relationship with somebody who doesn't love me. And then, oh, you know what I'd do? I'd start a nasty alcoholic spiral, right? Nobody says that, but that's what happens. That's what happens. You've heard all the stories, but the stories are true. University of Michigan researchers in 1978, a long time ago now, did a study of major Powerball lottery winners. And they saw what happened to their lives. And what did they find? They found that 6 months after they won the lottery, their lives were less happy permanently than the day before they played. And it was causal with respect to playing the lottery. How come? Now this gets interesting. What is it about playing the lottery that wrecks your life? The answer is, it blows your fuses. All the little things you really enjoy. Think about what gives you joy today. It's thinking about new ideas. I know that about you because you're here, right? It's spending time with family members and people you love. It's maybe watching a little TV tonight. It's going for a walk. It's maybe doing a little shopping, even going to the grocery store. Little things that give you joy. All your fuses get blown out by a major event involving unearned wealth. They just do, and you never enjoy it again. And you're looking for some sort of happiness that you got in the first flush of exuberance. And in doing that, you buy the stuff you don't like, you get involved in relationships that actually are exploiting you, and you start to use drugs and alcohol inappropriately. That's the reason people have these great and terrible disgraces in their lives. The basic bottom line is this. Don't try to change your luck massively, because you're not going to be able to do it very well, and it's not going to last very long. And never, 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 never spend even a second trying to get something that's unearned. Those are the two moral lessons that come out of this whole literature. So how do you affect the 40% best? You want to get the 40%? Here's what you do. You need a lifestyle that maximizes your likelihood of getting good luck. That's what you need. Don't try to do something big. You know, you say, if only I could get her to marry me, I'd be happy. If only I could get my law degree, I'd be happy. If only I can avoid an accident or getting sick, I won't be unhappy. Don't worry about that stuff. Don't try to do the big thing. lead a life where your likelihood of having good things enter into your experience happen at the maximum rate. And here's the good news. We know how to live that life. And here's the better news. I've got 12% of your happiness left. 48% is genetic, 40% is luck, 12% is completely under your control. And the 4 things you need to do to control that 12% are also the 4 things that give you the best luck or the highest likelihood of getting the good things that will give you the 40% at the greatest frequency. So here's what we got to know. What are the 4 things? Here's the secret. Here are the 4 things you need to spend all your time and energy on, and here's everything that's not one of these 4 things you need to start neglecting today. Okay? Everything, so make a list, and these 4 things are on it, and all the other 15 things you're worried about, and then go through your list and cross out everything that's not one of these 4 things. Okay? What are the 4 things you need to pay attention to? Faith, family, friends, and work. Nothing else will control your 12% and give you the best luck. That's the secret. Now, I'm not going to tell you which faith. I can tell you all about my religion, but no. Because it turns out the data say it's your faith that matters, not mine. Okay? I'm not talking about some transcendental truth here. I'm talking about the social science reality that faith matters most. Family is pretty self-explanatory. Community is your friends and things that you're doing right here with the people you know, the people who love that you're not related to. And I'm going to spend my time talking about work. So I could talk about the first 3, faith, family, and friends. I've got all the data on that, and I'm really interested in those things. But I want to talk about work. Now, first, what's not on the list? What's not one of the big 4? Money. Now, I'm an economist. I want money to be on that list. I mean, I got a PhD hoping that that was on the list. Joke's on me, totally, right? Money's not on the list of things that make you happy. And it's unambiguous. Now, sure, when people are desperately poor, when they're indigent, you can make them happier by giving them money because you can relieve certain pressures. But by the time we pass through indigence, by the time you become America, money doesn't buy happiness anymore. Since 1972, the average American has seen purchasing power, that's real purchasing power, increase by 150%. 150% since 1972, and that's every income group. You hear all the time that the rich are getting richer while the poor are getting poorer. It's nonsense. It's baloney. It's not true. The rich have gotten richer faster than the poor have gotten richer, to be sure. Income inequality is higher. But every income group has seen income increases, has seen real purchasing power increases. So how much happier are we? We're not. 31% of Americans say they're very happy in 1972. 31.5% of Americans say they're very happy today. It's an indistinguishable difference. Money doesn't buy happiness. Now, if you're like me, you say, okay, well, that's a population average. Give me a bunch of money and I'll show you, right? Make me real rich and I'll show you how you be happy, let me tell you. I'm moving to Aspen. Not true. You can increase the likelihood that people will make good decisions that make them happy until they're lower middle class. Above that, nothing. You will, however, over $75,000 a year for a family of 4, increase their stress. In other words, your stress decreases up to $75,000 in household income and then starts to increase again no matter how rich they get. 600 to 700 to 800 to 900 to a million, your stress goes up and up and up and up and up, and you're getting no happiness over $75,000 a year, okay? It's good to know given the fact that I manage a large workforce and I don't have to pay anybody ever more than $75,000 a year. Okay, so money doesn't buy happiness, money's not on the list. Work, however, is. The reason is not because it helps us make money. Work is on the list. Work is one of the secrets to happiness. And it's a weird thing. This is really, really American. You know, you've read Dilbert cartoons or watched The Office, and you know that work's a real drag, right? What percentage of Americans like or love their job? Are either satisfied or very satisfied with their work? What percentage of Americans? 89%. 89% of Americans like or love their jobs. And that has been stable for a long time. I started looking at that in 2004. I just looked at that last Thursday. And the 2010 data from the University of Chicago General Social Survey show it's exactly the same percentage, 89%. Well, it's probably only people that have college degrees, right? Wrong. Indistinguishable difference between people who are educated and people who are not. Probably people make a lot of money, right? Wrong. Above average income, below average income, statistically indistinguishable. The person who's making your sandwich today loves her job. The person who's going to bring your UPS package today loves his job. Chances are 9 in 10. This is a beautiful thing. We should celebrate. This is a great thing. You go to France, it's not true. About 40% of Americans are satisfied with their jobs. 40% in France. 90% in America, 40% of French. Where do you want to live? Well, it's my wife who's European. My wife is Spanish. She always used to say, we work to live. You live to work, right? It's actually an insult from the Europeans, but the joke's on them. Right now she's an American, she understands. The joke's on the Europeans. We have got something figured out. What is it? What is it about work in America that makes so many people happy, that makes it one of the big four? It makes it central to our lives. You understand what I'm talking about because every single person in here has done something satisfying and meaningful in your lives. What is it about it? It's not about the money. It gets us back to the little road. What's on that little road? The data are clear. It's what at AEI we call earned success. Earned success is the belief that you're creating value in your life and value in the lives of other people. People who say that they have earned their success, not that they're successful monetarily because it doesn't matter. I've studied social entrepreneurs my whole life, do-gooders, non-profit entrepreneurs who live on tap water and ramen noodles. But they acquire tremendous wealth and value by saving souls or cleaning up the environment or helping kids become literate or making sure that people in sub-Saharan Africa don't go to bed hungry. They acquire wealth in whatever currency that they find appropriate, or raising great kids or making beautiful works of art or whatever. The point is, if you believe you're earning your success, you're successful and you've earned it, you've sacrificed for it, you were able to fail but you didn't, then you will be happy. General Social Survey, University of Chicago. Data are clear. Take two people who are exactly the same. Age, race, sex, religion, region of origin, even same level of education. If they both say that they've earned their success, but one person earns 8 times as much money as a second, they will be equally likely to say that they are very happy about their lives. Money doesn't buy happiness, but earned success does. Now, who does this matter to? It matters to all of us. Because here's the thing that we need. I mean, I can tell you about earned success, and you can go earn your success, and you're the lucky ones, and so am I. But what we really need for everybody to avail themselves of this is a system. You got to have a system in which we can earn our success. What do we need in the system? We need a system in which values can meet passions, can meet skills, in a market for labor where you can find what makes you passionate. One of the problems that we know this as a fact in European social democracies. One of the problems is that labor markets don't work very well and people can't sort to the things that give them passion very well. Your dad was a postman, you're a postman. If you quit your job, you're going to be on the dole forever. Okay? I'm not making that up. This is not just sort of right-wing cant. This is true. This is one of the biggest problems with the rigidity of labor markets in Europe. Now, that leads to high unemployment rates, but that's not the problem. The real problem is that it leads to low happiness because skills can't meet passions. If you believe that people deserve the dignity of earned success, you got to say that's a mistake. Okay. You need a system in which skills meet passions. Number 2, you need a system that celebrates hard work and personal responsibility instead of saying, if you do that stuff, you're an exploiter, you're a sucker. You need a system that says, we love entrepreneurs, we love hard workers, we love people who show up, we love people, we think it's virtuous. We celebrate success instead of tearing it down. You need a system in which people can actually fail, not catastrophically, not where people go hungry, not where people go without a home and without health care. I'm not talking about that, but where people can fail. Because if you can't fail, you can't succeed. If you can't fail, you can't earn it because there is no sacrifice. Here's the good news. There is a system that exists that has these characteristics. There's a system that allows us to earn our success, and it's called the free enterprise system. It's not perfect. We need a government. Markets fail. But without the free enterprise system, we can't earn our success. Without earning our success, we can't be happy. If you believe, as our founders did in this country, in the moral proposition that we're endowed by our Creator with unalienable rights, among them being life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. If you believe that the moral covenant of our founders to us still is in vigor today, if you don't think that's nonsense, then you know we need a system in our country that has served every single person in this hall so well. that has given us so much happiness, and we have to work for it for everybody. Let me give you a practical detail before I close. Now, I've been talking about happiness, but now let's talk just for a second about survival, okay? When I was a kid, when I was a little kid, I remember reading the National Geographic like you did. What was the third world? What was the third world? The third world was malnourished kids with distended bellies and flies on their faces. It was a complete disaster area. It was famine. It was death. Thank God we lived in America, right? What's the third world today? Talk to my kids. The third world today is fast growth and the danger of taking American jobs. What's happened? Now, there's still tons of need around the world. And you may join me in believing we're morally commanded to treat the least of these, our brothers and sisters, with particular care and respect. But the world's better. How much better? From 1970 to today, the percentage of the world's population living on $1 a day or less has declined by 80%. 80%. And that's in adjusted dollar terms. What happened? Was it the UN? Was it the IMF? You know, if I talk to really Republican groups and say, was it the UN? It's like a laugh line, right? Was it the IMF or the World Bank? Those things are fine. But that's not the reason. Every one of you knows the reason that global poverty at the worst starvation level has declined by 80% since I was a kid. 5 things: globalization, free trade, property rights, the rule of law, and entrepreneurship. The American style of entrepreneurship that was spread around the world after 1970. It was the American free enterprise system that is the reason that millions and billions of people have not starved to death. That's a fact. Somebody is not going to bed hungry tonight because of your system, because of the stuff that you buy and the values that you propagate and what you fight for. It doesn't matter what your politics are, if you're a Democrat or a Republican or a liberal or conservative. If you believe that a free society in which people can earn their success is important, and you fight for that, somebody is going to be educating their child in a village you've never heard of and will never see. That's a fact. Bono, the singer of U2, said last week that the greatest achievement in the eradication of poverty was not foreign aid, it was capitalism. That was Bono, no big right-winger. And that's simply a statement of fact. Now, here's where it comes and hits us. I want them to not starve. I don't want people to go to bed hungry, but I also want to be happy. And I also want poor people to have the opportunity to lead happy lives in America. What am I going to do? The good news is the same thing. The same thing that's making sure that somebody doesn't go to bed hungry in China tonight is the same thing that will give somebody who's lower middle class, like I grew up, the opportunity to lead a happy life. It's simple, but we have to fight for it because it can go away. I'm going to close with a little bit of advice. I've given you some personal advice today, and I hope you'll take it in the spirit in which I've intended it. It's improved my life. Maybe it'll improve yours too. Don't spend a second on anything that's unearned. Spend all your time on the things that matter. Take your faith, family, your friends, and your work seriously. That's your life job. If you do that, you're going to lead a happier life starting right now, and make sure that other people understand these values as well. All right? This is not a political platform. This is happiness or unhappiness in your hands. Public policy advice. This is not political. If you believe the world deserves to be as happy as you and have the opportunities that you have, you need to fight not just for aid, you need to fight for a system that will make it possible on the level of billions of people, and there is literally only one system that does it. If you believe in happiness, you believe in earned success, you must fight for free enterprise. That's the policy advice. Now, how are we going to do it? We're going to hear from some of my colleagues. We're going to hear from Phill Swagel, who's an economist at AEI. We're going to hear about foreign policy from Dan Blumenthal, about the fastest growing semi-capitalist economy in the history of the world, which is China. We're going to hear about some practical advice to how to get it done. And if we have some time at the end, I'll be delighted to answer any questions that you have about what I've said today or anything else that you hear. My last word is this. For everything that you are doing, whether you know it or not, for people here in America and people around the world by fighting for these values, my only words are thank you and God bless you. Thanks.
Terrific.
Thanks a lot.
Very good.
Thanks.
Funny you didn't mention health.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Arthur. That was wonderful. Keep it. Keep it. Thank you, Arthur. That was really wonderful. And I love the way you combined and connected the personal happiness with social policy and policy, public policy. To continue on the public policy part, we have Phill Swagel with us. Phill had one of the great jobs in government because it was a crisis, and anybody in government at a time of crisis is blessed because challenges are fantastic. As Aristotle said, getting a crisis and trying to figure out something very complicated is far more satisfying than just going along and administering something that is set already. The economy seemed to be going along well in 2008, but as you know, everything came apart and the wheels came off the economic train at that time. And Phill was in the critical job of being Assistant Secretary for Economic Policy in the Treasury Department, and therefore started the TARP and started all kinds of different programs. Before that time, Phill was educated at Princeton, then got his master's and doctorate at Harvard University. And since that time, he has taught at Northwestern University, the University of Chicago, and Georgetown University, and now he's with the University of Maryland in public policy on that. Besides his academic credentials, Phill has long coached the Little League team of the Astros, and where his son plays. And the Astros over the years have done awfully well, as Phill has done awfully well. So it's a real mark of happiness and contribution and value added that Phill comes to us as a great economic advisor and a great coach. Please welcome Phill Swagel. Thank you.
Maybe I'll say a few words here. Good, thank you. I feel like we're going to go from happiness to the financial crisis, which is don't always think of as happiness. So I do want to just say with the baseball, so the son whose team I coach is now going into 7th grade. I've coached them since kindergarten. And so in 2008, of course that was 5 years ago, so this is a team of kids going into 2nd grade. And in that league, the coach is allowed to, on defense, coach from the outfield, right? So you've got your 9 or 10 kids playing defense, and the coach can basically be behind them, so that when the ball goes into the outfielder, you basically scream at them, throw the ball in, don't hold on to it, right? It takes a lot of skill to do that, but I was able to do it. And so my team and my son would make fun of me because, of course, I'd be in the outfield. I got to all their games, but with my BlackBerry in my hand, furiously responding. But I did make it to all the games. Okay, so I was going to talk for just a few minutes as introduction, and maybe I'll sit down and we can have conversation and take questions and criticisms. Criticisms welcome on what went right, what went wrong, and then missed opportunities. And obviously, a lot went wrong. There's a sense in which, if you know the old Matthew Broderick movie War Games, right? The only way to win is not to play, right? That's sort of the punchline from the movie. And the best way to do this is not to have a financial crisis, right? I mean, not to do all the bad lending and the bad decisions, the poor regulation, all the other things for the years prior to the crisis. It was too late, right? So I don't think that is something that went wrong during the crisis. It went wrong before the crisis. I think a legitimate criticism would also be to respond sooner, right? I mean, the crisis manifested most most sharply in the summer of 2007, right? So August 2007 is when investment vehicles started locking up, and the Fed's response was to cut interest rates, right? They said, the world's burning. Well, we're going to cut the interest rate. We're going to cut the Fed funds rate. They actually didn't in August. They waited till September. Only later, in November of 2008, was a program announced, the so-called TALF, the securitization backstop, that was announced in November 2008 by Hank Paulson, implemented in May of 2009 by Tim Geithner, so considerable continuity of policy there, as with so many other things, Guantanamo and other things between the Bush and Obama administrations. But in some sense, the Fed solved the problem of 2007 only in '08. And I think that's another legitimate criticism. So what went right? I would say Columbus Day of 2008 is the day that went the most right? That's the day that the bankers were summoned to the Treasury and convinced, some willingly, some less willingly, to accept public capital, right? So $125 billion of public capital put into the banks. At the same time, the FDIC, under then Chair Sheila Bair, extended an unprecedented guarantee to bank lending. Right? So these two things together, public money as capital, and then a public guarantee on bank lending, so both capital and liquidity, in some sense told the world the United States is standing behind our banking system. It is an unprecedented intervention in our markets, incredibly blunt, right? I mean, I think very good arguments could have been made that certain institutions were insolvent and should have been put under, right? They weren't. The system as a whole was stabilized, and I would say that worked. And it's just the continuity of policy from the fall of '08 into 2009 on the financial rescue, it worked. It was blunt, it was ugly, but it worked. All right, so that's what went right. What went wrong was obviously the policies did not avert the Great Recession. We all know the incredible misery that ensued starting from 2008 when the economy essentially did this, right? And I'll point to three misses there, three things that could have been done better and about which I think historians will write the regrets for years and decades to come. Okay, so number one is the fall of 2008, the way the TARP was introduced. Right, we all know the infamous split screen between the stock market on one side and the congressional vote in the House of Representatives on the other side, as the first vote on the TARP legislation was voted down and the stock market plunged. There's a sense in which Americans, maybe people all over the world, but certainly Americans, looked at Washington and said, maybe I'm not affected directly by Lehman Brothers' failure or AIG's failure or securitization's failure. I don't have a subprime loan, but I look at Washington and these guys don't know what they're doing. Right? I think we thought we did, but I understand the translation from what we were doing in Washington to the rest of the country was rough at best. And there's a sense in which Americans, families and businesses just hit pause. They said, well, look, I was going to hire someone, I was going to invest, I was going to buy a car, I was going to buy a house, pause. And you saw it, the economy just fell off a cliff. And so this sense in which there's a lack of confidence. The confidence was just destroyed. And that was in some sense a failure, right? That's how we went from financial crisis to Great Recession. The second miss then was in January of 2009 or February of 2009. Then in some sense the new administration had a chance to reboot, had a chance to say, they could have said, look, those guys got it wrong and we're going to do it better, or we're going to do the right things, they got some things right, we're going to continue, or whatever they could have done. And in some sense, for whatever reasons, we can all think about who to blame, but it was missed. It was a missed opportunity to reboot and to shore up confidence in our system, and that was unfortunate. Number three, then, is housing. We all understand that housing was ultimately at the bottom of the financial crisis. I suspect the Obama administration badly wishes they had done a really massive housing bailout early in 2009. And they could have, right? They had the TARP, they had both houses of, the House and the Senate. And in some sense, they were prudent, right? It was very unfair to bail out people who bought too big a house, who could have bought this house, but instead bought this house, or all the things that went wrong during the lead up to the crisis. And they weren't. They were prudent, and I think in retrospect, they wish they had been imprudent and unfair and just did a massive bailout. And that was, again, we can argue about whether it was the right thing or the wrong thing, but it was a missed opportunity. Okay, so why don't I stop there? And yeah.
Thank you, Phil. Let me ask you, and we'll open it up in a minute, but let me ask you a few questions on this now. And that is basically that you talk about Columbus Day. We're going to get the mic on in just 1 minute. We're going to talk about Columbus Day of '08, and you talk about a missed opportunity to reboot for the Obama administration, and then for the massive housing. And all that sounds logical and everything, but it doesn't sound consistent with the idea that we heard from Arthur before, that AEI is for passion for just getting stuff that you do directly rather than going to the government for help. Because I think what you can say is that of all the things that happened before '08, too much government intervention or regulation wasn't it. There was some cause to all this that brought down the economy severely, and the remedy certainly was big government, more government. And even you said just 2 minutes ago, that there should have been big bailouts. So how do you square that with the whole thrust of AEI?
Okay, absolutely. No.
Yours works.
Mine's work. Okay, very good. Okay. Instead, I would differentiate then between the run-up to the crisis and what to do when the crisis is upon you. And so I would direct people to look at the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission, which published a book about this thick, and I would ignore that book. At the very end, there are 2 dissents, right? The dissents were limited to just a couple pages each, but they're both excellent, right? So one is by my AEI colleague, Peter Walzok, who's here, who really goes into detail about this, about the government interventions in the housing market that contributed enormously to the financial crisis. And then the other is by 3 others, Doug Holteken, Keith Hennessy, and Bill Thomas, that take a broader look at the other failures that led into the crisis. And they don't only blame government. They say, look, there are lots of failures, financial markets, including a failure of regulation. But there's importantly the involvement of the government in contributing to this. And I should say, look, I was in the Bush White House for much of President Bush's first term when the home ownership numbers were going up, and especially for low-income families for minorities, reaching historic highs. And every month, President Bush celebrated that. And obviously, in retrospect, that's really uncomfortable. It looks really, really uncomfortable. So I have no problem in saying, getting into the crisis, the involvement of the government and the missteps of the government were important contributors. Once we're in the crisis, right, government action was an essential part of it. And I think that's perfectly consistent.
But when you wind back and look at before the crisis, okay, supposing, and I've read Peter's stuff, and it's wonderful, wonderful material, and it's very convincing to me anyway, but when you look at it beforehand, supposing, just in theory, there had been a regulation that you can't get a mortgage for a house that there's no way in the world you're going to ever pay for, okay? Supposing you just design that, no matter how you economists word that, but you had enormous number of mortgages that admittedly, and Peter has shown this convincingly, were encouraged by the government and all kinds of government programs. Now it started with Clinton and went right on to George W. Bush. But supposing you didn't have that kind of support and you said you have to be responsible. If you're going to take out a mortgage, you have to be able to pay it at some point in your life, which makes common sense. That would have averted a large part of this. So it wasn't the fact that there was no regulations, but the regulations were wrong.
Well, I guess I have two thoughts. One is the regulations were there. The banking regulators had the authority. Right, and the Fed had authority over the consumer protection side, including of mortgage lending, and didn't use it. The banking regulators, the FDIC, the OCC, and the Fed had the authority, even in cases like AIG, which wasn't well regulated by any federal regulator. Their counterparties were regulated, right? So if the Fed was worried about AIG, they could have gone to the counterparties and said, "You cannot." We're worried about the systemic effects of this other person. You need to take that into account. So I think the regulators did have the power. They didn't use it well. On the other hand, there are lots of bad decisions made by many people, both the banks and non-bank originators, the investors, the rating agencies, the asset managers. Sort of go from top to bottom. I mean, there's a sense in which, if you think of the tragedy with the first space shuttle that was destroyed, that blew up, the Challenger, right? There was one O-ring. And so this was the opposite, right? That O-ring was good, no tragedy. This was the opposite. Everything failed from top to bottom. So I don't think it's just the lack of regulation. And the question in my mind is, why did these private investors, who should have had every incentive to protect their own interests, why didn't they? And that's, to me, that I don't know the answer, but it's both government and the private
Well, some
sector.
of the private protectors were feeling they'd be bailed out by the government. I mean, it was too big to fail, and therefore, if you invest in it, I'm safe because Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the government is going to bail me out, so there's no risk on this.
Yep.
I get a big reward, much better than bonds, but the government's there to bail me out. So it's the government idea that kind of screwed up the problem. But then, as you say, that when you get into the problem, the government is there to rescue you on that. Questions?
Yeah, actually,
to
can I just
start?
say, and they were right. Those investors who bought bonds from Fannie and Freddie, counting on the government to rescue them, they were right. They were rescued. And that's a challenge, is how to get at this too big to fail problem.
It was a smart decision.
Yeah.
Give your question real loud, and we'll be fine.
My name is James Spector, and I'm very glad you brought up the question of Fannie and Freddie.
Yeah. There you go. We got a mic there.
Oh, good. Okay, thanks.
you.
If I could speak softer, good.
Yeah, good. Thank you.
You mentioned the bailout. AIG's holders were bailed out, I believe, 100 cents on the dollar. And one of the main was, of course, Goldman Sachs. The holders of Fannie and Freddie debt, however, got nothing. And when you make this distinction, it's very confusing to me how that distinction could be made, whereas the private banks would get all their money back, and what at one time was a major holding of a lot of funds, a lot of retirees, was effectively wiped away.
Okay, no, good. It's exactly the right question. I think this is one of the enduring questions about the bailout. And just to make one, you said one wrong word. I know you didn't mean to. The Fannie and Freddie debt holders, of course, were bailed out. It was the equity holders who were wiped out, or I realize. Yeah, exactly. I realize the preferred shares. Okay, so let me take those in turn, and I'll be really brief. They're slightly different situations, right? So AIG, the counterparties, and including inevitably Goldman Sachs, right? AIG's business model was they had very successful sort of world champion companies, and then they had this thing in London that was basically a hedge fund, and all their assets were cross-collateralized, right? So the hedge fund blew up, was writing CDOs and things like that. That blew up, had losses. The federal government, to impose losses on the counterparties, to say, look, you creditors, you French banks and you investment banks in the U.S., you've got to take a haircut, right? If any one of those had refused, then every single company globally would have been in default because all the assets were interlocked. Now, the French government was an important counterparty through French-owned banks, told the banks, you cannot take a haircut. You cannot, right? So, okay, so you have the two large French banks refusing, and that meant imposing a haircut, right, which is A, illegal, but B, let's say, somehow, obviously the current administration doesn't let that get in the way, and you do it anyway. That would have meant that every single part of AIG in every single country would have been in default. The regulators of every country and every state would have had the fiduciary obligation to grab the assets, right? The insurance regulator of California would have had the fiduciary obligation to grab every asset he could or she could in California to satisfy the policyholders in California. So this is, Chairman Bernanke has said, it's the most infuriating thing, but in being able to impose losses on any counterparty, within 24 hours, as a practical matter, is impossible. Now, Goldman Sachs, I don't know whether it's right or not. Goldman Sachs claims that they came off worse because they were more than fully hedged. So who knows? But it's really not an issue of Goldman. It's an issue of, it's one of these things. It would have been great to do it. Once you get down to brass tacks, it's not feasible. Okay, so that's one. Fannie and Freddie is a tougher situation. AIG in the end was solvent but illiquid. Fannie and Freddie were deeply insolvent. And so the losses among shareholders of Fannie and Freddie, those shareholders eventually might get something back. It's hard to say, but they probably should have gotten nothing back. So my guess is they're going to get better than they expected. there's a lot more to it. I don't want to kind of go on, but I'm happy to continue the conversation because there's a lot more to it. But the AIG thing is really it's a tough one.
But let me just say that,
Yeah, please.
people like you are very brilliant, and you know all these exceptions, and you know the consequences and everything like that. But from the outside, it looks like if you have a lot of influence, if you have very good lobbyists, if you have fat cat people in Washington who came from Goldman Sachs, who came from this institution, then you can get helped. And for people who don't have that kind of influence, you're out on the street.
Yeah, I agree. And that's one of the terrible consequences of the bailout is that appearance, and that's something that across both the Bush and Obama was a failure, right? A failure to explain that. And maybe it's impossible, but we should have and could have done better.
Yep. Please.
Hi, my name is Rick Schwartz. Just by way of background, I spent my entire career dealing with helping financial institutions raise capital, including Fannie, Freddie, AIG, Countrywide, et cetera. So I have two questions, one general, one specific. The general question is, if I heard you right, you said that with the benefit of hindsight, the government should have bailed out the housing industry. Did I hear that correctly?
No, the Obama administration wishes they had. So it's a positive statement, not a normative one.
So my question about that, quite generally, is how would you suggest that they could have actually bailed out homeowners that were deeply underwater on houses that arguably they never should have bought? That's question one. Question two, which is far more specific, and it gets back to what this gentleman over here was asking.
Okay.
As I know, based on your background that you've studied, in 2012, the government amended the terms of the senior preferred that they put into the two agencies, and they created what they called a sweep agreement, which they're now quite happily bragging about all the money that they're taking in, as the agencies are now making enormous amounts of money, and all that money is being swept into the government instead of being used to pay down the preferreds and actually create net worth, which would fall to the benefit of the common shareholders.
Yep.
If
Okay, now
could
you have to
address
take that second question and put it into English
Okay,
somehow.
I got it. No, I'll explain.
I'm
thank you.
sure it's a brilliant
Okay.
question.
No, these are
but,
growth.
I
they're
didn't
great.
I didn't understand the first thing
Okay,
about it.
thank you. They're both great. They're both great questions. And okay, so bailout housing. And again, that was a positive statement, not a normative one, saying, I testified about how unfair it would have been. But in February of 2009, right at the Obama administration, it just said, look, you're underwater. You made a mistake. The bank should never lend you money. It's unfair. Poof, we're going to just we're going to write a bunch of checks, effectively write checks, and you're going to be now above water or even. Totally unfair, right? I mean, it says rewarding the people who bought the most house that they couldn't afford. There are ways they could have done it. The FDIC had a plan that sometimes relied on an insurance scheme, which insurance is sometimes a little less transparent than just writing a check. Would have said to the banks, okay, you bank, you write down the mortgage, right? We're gonna give you insurance. You write down the mortgage, and if the homeowner defaults, like even though you've written down the mortgage, the homeowner defaults, we're gonna cover it. We're gonna cover your losses. Now, given the recession, a lot of those people would have defaulted. So the government would have been writing really big checks. Most of the money would have flowed to banks, but there would have been a couple million homeowners who might have been able to make it. That would have been a bailout. Again, I think most of the value of that bailout would have gone to the banks, but some homeowners would have done it. So that's one way they.
And are you saying
they
that
could
it
have
was a
done
good idea or a bad idea?
No, I'm conflicted.
Yeah,
I
but
think
come on, tell us if it's
So
good idea or bad idea.
On the whole, I think it was a bad idea. There are better ways to do it if you want to do a housing bailout, because that's one that it looks like it's helping the homeowners, but it's really helping the banks. It's really a bailout for the hedge funds. And if you Google Swagel financial crisis, you'll see something I wrote for a conference at Brookings that goes into this in detail. And we shared our analysis with then Professor Elizabeth Warren, and she agreed with it, that this was a bailout for hedge funds, not for people. But you could have done it, okay? And in this transparency was your enemy there, or the enemy, to do it non-transparently. Okay, the profit sweep. So Fannie and Freddie are really profitable now, and
the Treasury Department under Tim Geithner basically forced the two firms to send their profits to the government rather than to the pre-takeover shareholders. I think that's misguided, right? I would rather get to housing finance reform, and there's lots of controversy about what the right way to do it is, but I would rather move forward, and that means buying back the taxpayer investments in those companies and getting those companies either out of business, sell them off, restore them, right? There's lots of different plans. The House has one plan. There's a plan in the Senate. And that would involve undoing this profit sweep, right? The government shouldn't get the profits of these companies in perpetuity, because then that will contribute to a housing system controlled by the government. And I think that's the worst thing of all. So I agree with your question that the action of effectively nationalizing Fannie and Freddie in perpetuity is a mistake, and we should figure out what the right way to unwind that. And that's another subject.
All right, when you said before that, the whole crisis in '08 and after that had a lot of causes to it. Could anything like that happen again?
Oh, absolutely. It's human nature. I mean, I think, obviously the Dodd-Frank...
That would hurt our happiness, I'll tell
That
you
would hurt our happiness, yeah. I'm really here just to anything...
Where's Arthur when we need him?
Yeah, any happiness you got from Arthur, I'm here to, so
You can clean up
yeah, exactly.
on that. Yeah.
I'm making the boss look good. But absolutely. I mean, look, the Dodd-Frank legislation had some good things in it, but it had some not so good things in it, and humans are humans, right? And the same regulators who didn't prevent it last time, or the same lenders and borrowers who made mistakes last time are still the same people. We're all still human. So absolutely. I think there is a better authority to deal with it. Whether that authority will be used well or not well, there is the ability to intervene in a way that wasn't the case. When Lehman failed, the Treasury Secretary had no authority, right? Anyone who says, oh, Paulson should have saved Lehman, fine, open the Code of Federal Regulation or whatever, open the law, and tell me what sentence he would have used to intervene. Well, that's going to be crickets are going to start chirping. And now there is authority. Whether it's a good idea or a bad idea is a long conversation, but there is authority that didn't exist.
So there was no authority to bail out Lehman, but there was authority to bail out AIG?
So this is...
That sounds odd. I thought by the time of AIG, no one cared about the authority or not.
So it's a controversy that I think will be...
Is that right or
wrong?
No.
So this is... The Fed bailed out AIG. Remember, the TARP didn't exist when Lehman and AIG failed. So the Fed bailed out AIG, and the Fed looked at Lehman and said, you guys stink. They said it more colorfully. You're insolvent, right? I mean, all the assets, they said, here are your assets, here are your liabilities. Those liabilities are bigger than your assets. We cannot lend to you, right? The Fed can only lend against good collateral. Lehman didn't have good collateral. Well, they looked at AIG and said, AIG, you're a great company. God, you have this one part that is just a nightmare, but the rest of you looks good. And so the Fed lent and said, we're going to lend against the bad part, collateralized by the entire good part. Now, who knows if that was exactly, that calculation was exact, but to the Fed's eyes, that was close enough to being good collateral that they could do it. So that's the difference. So this is a conversation I've had with people from the Fed, sort of after the fact, is what would have happened if the Fed had just done it and just said, look, we don't think, they might not have said it, they might have said, we're going to lend to Lehman and save them. I think the Federal Reserve would have taken massive losses from lending to Lehman, and so that would have been a real long-term problem for the Fed.
Okay.
Yeah.
What else? Other questions? Yeah. Oh, right here. Yep. We got there. Go on.
And I'll be really fast in my
go on,
answers.
go
I
on.
realize
Then
I'm
Steph.
going on a bit.
My name is Jay Bernstein, and I'm a capitalist, and I run a business. But I'm thinking about what's happened in the last 10 years, and I can't cite anywhere near the examples there are. But in the commodities business, we regulate the clearinghouses, but MF Global takes the customer's money. They're free to invest it. And the regulators allow this, the CME allows this. We have banks who are creating securitized instruments or creating instruments so that basically whoever lends money for a house doesn't have it doesn't have to have any skin in the game. Every week, we're reading that whether it's J.P. Morgan or Goldman or Merrill, some other institutions getting sued or settling for $50 or $100 billion. When the S&P and Goldman, they came out, this was sort of astonishing. It has to be astonishing to the American people. They said, well, when we rate these things, nobody pays attention because they know we don't mean it, right? So I'm sitting here saying, when most of us take counterparty risk in our business, if the company goes under, we eat the loss.
Yep.
Okay. So I'm sitting here saying to myself, now I've been a capitalist, and we believe in the free enterprise system, but how can you, with all of this that's gone on, how can you possibly say that the free enterprise system and capitalism works? I mean, how does this work? How is this fair? How does it work?
Okay, so the litany that you gave is exactly, I think, the right one. And you could go on, more scandals. And the earlier question about the bailout of, you can say, look, the bondholders of Bear Stearns, they got bailed out. The bondholders of AIG got bailed out, of Fannie and Freddie, and not the preferred shareholders. All these things. And to me, that's the scandal, is the picking and choosing. We don't have time to defend corporate capitalism in the system. Arthur did some of that. I would say the solution, or a big part of the solution, is aligning interests and bringing capital back into the capitalist system, and to give investors the incentive for prudence. And so, not having a system where, in some sense, the loan is made and then the interest in the loan is sold off, and then the subsequent investors don't have the incentive to monitor the quality, or don't exercise the incentive to monitor the quality of the loan. And fundamentally, that's capital, right? Making sure that the people have money at stake before any government intervention, right? So I think ultimately, if things collapse, the government will intervene, right? I can't tell you how bad it has to get, but at some point the government will intervene, where there's the Fed, the Treasury, the Congress, someone will intervene. I want as much capital as possible standing in front of taxpayers so that we know who the losses are. And real capital, not AIG's AAA rating, which evaporated, but people with really their money at stake, and so we know that the losses are taken. Let me just finish really quickly. There's a great speech that Ben Bernanke gave in, I think it's March of '07, about aligning the interests of investors and regulators and the role of capital in doing that. So it's something like financial regulation in the invisible hand. And I would recommend that speech. If you Google search Bernanke Invisible Hand, you will get to that speech. It's really a great speech.
But let me follow up on this question, because I think it's a really good one. There's a distinction between the government laying out regulations, rules, everything, and you think to yourself, okay, they apply to everybody. We know what they are. Ideally, they should not be changed very much. They should be predictable, so we can go do our planning on the basis of regulations, on the basis of what the rules are, and go about and compete, okay? And then that's fair, and that seems right. What doesn't seem right, and it seems unfair, is to pick and choose. And people like you in a crisis situation, very dedicated, very wonderful, and very brilliant, you're picking companies to help, and you're picking in those companies individual bond shares, individual, type A sharers, whatever all this lingo is, and you're saying these guys are winners, these guys are losers. Why? Because I said so, okay? And you have all this justification, but it doesn't sound right, and it doesn't sound fair.
Right. No, I think that's right. So if you Google Swagel financial crisis, you'll find this 60-page paper I wrote that goes through each instance and says, look, here, Bear Stearns, that's why it's done this way, Lehman this way. And so the justification is there. Internally, it made sense, but externally, you're exactly right. To the outside world, you're exactly right. It looked arbitrary. And I think that's the challenge. There's two challenges. One is predictability, and then two is respect for collateral. Right? If we want to say there's capital behind a loan, we have to have predictable rules and an order of priority for collateral, and that's a challenge. So there's moving back to a regime like bankruptcy and away from the arbitrary interventions.
Okay.
Yeah.
Steph, last question, right here.
Hi, Stefan Edlis. We know there are laws against gambling, right? I know there may be an art dealer on Madison Avenue may go to jail because he was gambling. When you want to write insurance on a picture, says how much is it worth? $1 million. The guy says, no, I'm only going to insure what it's really worth. You go to a life insurance agent and you say, I want to buy insurance for $2 million on my own life. He says, no, you're not worth it. How much are you making a year? Okay, now this is the fundamental. We come to the so-called side bets where you're insuring something where there simply is no value. And why isn't there a law that prohibits doing that? And why the Republicans, excuse expression, many of whom are my good friends, why are they resisting that?
Okay.
Some of your best friends are Republicans. That's a phrase you can use in Aspen. Very nicely.
No, very good. Okay. So let me start by saying, I'm going to answer the question. So I'm a professor at the University of Maryland. I know we're out of time, and unfortunately, after this session, I have to bail out. But I'm not.
Speaking of bailout.
Yeah, exactly. It's my personal one. I'm not avoiding everyone. Anyone who wants to talk further, my contact information is pswagel@umd.edu. You can easily find me, or at pswagel@aei.org, and I'm happy to continue the conversation by email if you're in Washington or wherever. I suspect wherever you live, I'll eventually get there. So anyways, I apologize if I'm avoiding. On the gambling, let me just first blow my own horn. I wrote a movie review. There's a movie, Inside Job, which won an Academy Award, and then there's an HBO film, Too Big to Fail. And so I wrote a movie review of the two of those. You might not be surprised that I'm much more sympathetic to the HBO film than to the documentary Inside Job, which basically says everyone's a thief and a criminal and Goldman Sachs. The irony, of course, of that film has Elliot Spitzer as the saint criticizing the sinners, so which is, it's an irony. So on gambling, it's a really tough one, right? I mean, when President Clinton, in some sense, declined to regulate derivatives in the late 90s, that has become an enormously controversial decision. And obviously, Larry Summers, that's coming back to affect him today. I think there's enormous value in derivatives, right? I have a derivative. I have fire insurance on my house, right? My house burns down. Someone else takes the part of the loss. But of course, as you said, that's on my own house. It's not on my neighbor's house. On the other hand, if I want to take out insurance on, there could be some things where I can't take out direct insurance on some aspect of a financial market, but I can get a correlation by doing it on some other assets. So I'm being very vague here. But there is value in these kinds of derivatives and letting people bet on things that are not in their own interest. I think the key is to make sure that they don't have the ability to influence it. So I know I'm being very vague here, but I think there is value to these derivatives. One improvement that has been made since the crisis, and has started work that Tim Geithner did when he was president of the New York Fed, and has been continued, right? So I'm giving credit to the Obama guys here, and I think that they deserve a lot of credit, is improving the transparency, right? It used to be that these bets, these side bets, were really side bets. You and I would make a side bet, and no one else would know, including the regulators, and a lot of that has been brought out into the open. Now, the risk then is on the exchange and the clearinghouse, so the risk is still there, it's concentrated, but at least it's in the sunlight. So I think that's the better way to go, not to outlaw these side bets, but that's my judgment, and it's a source of enormous controversy. So I can't answer the question, but I can say that is like exactly the debate going on in Washington now over the Fed and over regulation. And I have my view, but I think there's been progress, and it's still an active debate. So
Thank you. Let me ask you one last question, and then we're going to move on to Dan. And that is, you're in public policy and you're pushing for ideas. What's the one big idea you're pushing for right now to, make sure that we don't go through this kind of crisis again, and to get the economy humming,
again.
in the way
Yeah.
that Arthur recommends for our happiness and everybody's happiness.
Yeah.
What's your big thrust in public policy?
Okay, so I'll tell you one thing I'm working on a lot now, which is housing finance, and that's reform of Fannie and Freddie. So I worked a lot in helping Senators Corker and Warner, right, from Tennessee and Virginia, Republican and Democrat, come up with a proposal for how to change the housing finance system, including what to do with Fannie and Freddie. And in some sense, where I start with is by saying the government will intervene in housing. I might not like it, but I think it's inevitable. So let's formalize that. Let's make people pay in advance for any possibility of intervention. Let's have a lot of private capital first, right? The losses of Fannie and Freddie together were about 4% of their assets. So the Corker-Warner bill has 10% capital required, right? So before the government kicks in with any intervention, private investors have to take 10% losses. Now, 10% is not 100, but it's 2.5 times what happened during this cycle. So I think it's closer to 100 than it is to 0, but obviously it's not 100, and there's always going to be moral hazard and the dangers of intervention when there's any government guarantee. But again, I start from the place of saying there will be intervention, and so I'd rather formalize it than hold out, in some sense letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. So I think that's it. Let's get a housing system where the rules are set, private capital, not the government, is driving the decisions, and I think that would be progress. But obviously others disagree, right? And there's some people who say, look, we should have a private system, and I understand that, and that's in some sense, that's part of the debate that we have in DC right now.
All right.
So,
Thank you very much.
No, thank you.
Phill, thank you. Thank you very much. That was great. All right, rounding out the morning, we have the view from Asia and China, and Dan Blumenthal. Dan got his degrees from Washington University at School of Advanced and International Studies at Johns Hopkins, and a law degree from Duke University. His father and grandfather got him interested in Asia because they were in Indonesia and very involved in Jakarta for many, many years. And as far as hobbies, he has 3 hobbies. Those are his kids, age 5 to 10. And when he's not thinking about Asia, going to Asia, or writing about Asia, testifying about Asia, he's dealing with the kids. Ladies and gentlemen, Dan Blumenthal.
Thank you very much. And if you think that Phill made you less happy than Arthur did, I guarantee you that I'll make you less happy than Phill did. And it's not just because it's not just me, and it's not just AEI. It's anyone who works in foreign policy. My brethren inside the Obama administration and my friends at the Brookings Institute and other places. Foreign policy is not a happy business, unfortunately, despite what Arthur said about so much human flourishing, because I think of policies that we took here in the United States, as well as our continued commitment to projecting our power forward in places like the Asia-Pacific region that has allowed for these countries to not fight each other, to stop fighting each other, and to focus on things like economic growth. I don't promise you facts and figures, so I'm kind of, the stepchild of this conference right now, because I can't give you happiness, I can't give you data, I can give you some fun facts about China, I can give you hopefully a little humor, and then I think I can give you some science fiction or fantasy and horror as well. So let me try to do all those things. So let's just start with what we've seen from China in the last year. So this is probably the year that, at least at the elite level of U.S. society, people kind of figured out there might be a problem here. And that's because the revelations of the unbelievable amounts of cyber attacks China has taken against not just the U.S. government, not just weapons technology, but against U.S. businesses, just the terabytes of data that China has stolen from their competitors in U.S. businesses and in other places. And it was tracked back by a security firm in Washington and reported in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and other places that it all originates in Shanghai, part of the Chinese government, part of the Chinese military that has an army of very smart hackers who do this on a constant basis. And I think if I heard anything, I've been saying for many, many years, as other people have been saying, look, China's kind of a problem for us, let's focus on it. But I think this year you really got people saying, wow, China's kind of a problem for us. I mean, what does all this cyber attacking and cyber hacking mean for us personally? And the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal and others were harassed just because the Chinese government didn't like what they were writing about, which is what goes on in China as well. Other things that happened this year is China and Japan almost went to war this year, which a lot of people didn't know about. They don't like each other. There's a power political struggle. They're fighting over a bunch of rocks in the East China Sea, but the Chinese came very, very close to actually firing at a Japanese ship this year, which would have caused untold damage and unspeakable unpredictability in terms of how the United States and Japan would have reacted to all of that. Now, what I've described for you right here in just two examples, I should also say that the transition in government this year to new leaders, while there seem to be some reformers in the Chinese government, certainly the president, Xi Jinping, certainly is bolstering the military and support from the military and encouraging them to continue to go out and build their tremendous capabilities and to continue to go out and seek what China believes is its rights in the maritime areas of the East China Sea and the South China Sea and other places that actually matter a great deal to the United States because of our role as a global superpower. This is a China that is very familiar to us, I think most familiar to most of us in many ways, which is a great power and an authoritarian state that plays the game of great power politics, is a strong power that has translated all its economic resources, or a lot of it, into its power and influence and so on and so forth. This is what I would call a modern state, a modern nation state, a modern China, familiar to any country in the 19th or 20th century and so on. It's what we worry about the most in many ways. It's what our military worries about. It's what our president worries about. It's what our foreign policy apparatus worries about. But that is by far not the whole story of China. The next China that I want to speak about is a much different China. It's a China of cosmopolitan entrepreneurs. It's a China that is deeply, deeply embedded in the global production chain and the global value chain. There isn't a good or product really in electronics or computers or automotive or anything high-tech that isn't somehow at least assembled or value-added in China. It's not only value-added in China, it's done so in Taiwan and Japan and South Korea and the United States, but this is a country that is deeply enmeshed in the international financial system. So much so, I would say, that when the reformers in China this year decided that they were going to squeeze up credit and squeeze up loaning because the masses of bad debts. Goldman has a report, I guess Goldman was discredited in the last session, but Goldman has a report out this, and their research is pretty good. I haven't seen it. I haven't seen the report. I've seen the report on the report that says China may have up to $3 trillion of bad debt on the books right now. That's half of its economy. But this is the China that decided not to bail out and not to do another stimulus and not to lend out these loans anymore. And when that happened, many markets, as many of you know, around the world just tanked. And that shows the interconnectivity of this China, of international financiers, of entrepreneurs, of reformers, has an effect on the rest of the world. This is what I would call a postmodern China. This is a China that is involved in the postmodern economy of globalization and the free flow of capital, ideas, and knowledge, both for good or for bad. But then there's and I should also mention a few fun facts about this China. This China is driving right now the market in luxury items. And why do I focus on luxury items? Is because so often we think of China as the polluted China, or as the China that's acting in bad ways in the military sphere, or so on. But The Economist, which is good at many things, is also very good at titles. And it had a title on China this year called Beyond Bling. And I didn't know anything about the fact that China is driving the luxury market right now until I read this article, and it said, look, it's not just that China's driving the luxury market. If you want to do well in the luxury market in China right now, you have to go beyond bling. So you have to go and do things that are less ostentatious and give Chinese shopper the same kind of experience they would have in Paris or in New York or wherever else fashion dictates. This is a China where the Porsche market is the fastest growing market in the world, where it's the biggest consumer of beer. And I'm not just talking about the 15-cent beer I used to get when I was backpacking. I'm talking about every kind of beer you could possibly imagine, from Heineken's to Carlsberg to beer mergers and acquisitions and so on. This is driving all the luxury brands to jump into China. And even if, this is how complicated China is, even if that's just 2% or 3% of the population who could afford these brands, that's still 30, 40 million people, the size of a not small country. So this is a China that you see when you go through Shanghai. This is a China that many people who do business in China see, and so on and so forth. Like I said, this kind of postmodern China where consumption is really driving world markets as well. Then there's this other China that we all kind of know about, but it's the hardest to get your head around, really, right? So we all know, for example, that China is getting old before it gets rich. We all know that now, right? The one-child policy, which people in the 1970s, not only in China, but also in the Western world, thought was a great idea. This was the age of the population explosion and everything else, and saying that we got to get rid of kids because we don't have enough resources and all the rest of it. Well, now it's coming home to roost in China. They don't have enough children to support retiring age Chinese. The working age population in China, this is very hard to get your head around, but shrunk last year for the first time, which is why labor market is getting so much more expensive. What are they going to do? So there's one child. Usually it's one child with two parents and four grandparents. In the past, it used to be that the child was the social insurance and the pension policy in China. It can't happen anymore. There's no way that one child can support that amount of retirees, and the fact that retirees are growing. China has no system in place to deal with the amount of retirees that are basically coming online right now. You just look at small statistics like how many nursing facilities, how many beds are there in nursing facilities in China right now. It's covering all of 2% of the demand right now, and it's just going to get worse because China's just getting older more and more quickly. Now let's get to the science fiction portion of the program, okay? So the science fiction of the portion of the program is this. The State Department, for the first time, made a link between the one-child policy, the implications of that, the fact that Chinese families favor boys and have abandoned baby girls or given them up at a huge clip, such that now we have 118 girls born for 100 boys, other way around, 118 boys born for 100, I was fantasizing for a second, born for every 100 girls. And they're linking that up now. Everyone was wondering, not everyone, but people in this field were wondering what the social impact of that would be. Besides just the moral outrage and the horrendousness of abandoned baby girls, Arthur Brooks, the president of AEI, has an adopted Chinese daughter that was found on a bench 12 hours after birth. I mean, just horrific stories about this. State Department linked this year the level of child trafficking, of stealing of boys from other families, of stealing of brides from Vietnam and Burma and the other regions, and the rest of it, to the fact that they have such a gender imbalance in China, and it's only getting worse. And in a society that favors boys, and in a society that is so unequal, I mean, we talk about inequality here, but it's just nothing compared to what is going on in China, and it's corrupt. I mean, the inequality, if you just followed the case of the ousted party secretary of Chongqing province, Bo Xilai, just look at the numbers in terms of how much money those people skimmed off the top, hundreds of millions of dollars. just multiply that by 500 and so on. And just think about that for a second, the level of corruption. Think the lowest end of Chinese society, the males, at the lowest end, there's no way they're going to find brides. And think about the social implications of that going forward. Think about they can't find jobs. They can't. Arthur's four principles of happiness. They will have none of them, and they will just be excess males in a very bad situation that could end up with all kinds of science fiction implications for the security of states around them and the security of China, and so forth. There's also this part of China, which I call the kind of pre-modern China, China that has state capacity problems, that has areas where it's not really governing very well. There's a joke going around, and for those, I think, like Ken, who followed the Soviet Union's demise, when the gallows humor starts, it could be the beginning of the end, right? So here's one joke that goes around in China, and that's this. And if anyone who's been to China will kind of get this. And if you don't get it, don't worry about it. It's a Chinese joke, and I'm not going to say it in Mandarin because maybe I might as well, actually. But don't worry about it. The point is that these jokes are going around in China. So the guy from Beijing calls up his friend in Shanghai, and he says, my life is so great in Beijing. All I have to do is open up a window every morning, and I get a free smoke. It's great. And the guy in Shanghai says, and this was right after they found 20,000 dead pigs floating in the river of Shanghai and so forth. The guy from Shanghai says, that is nothing. My life is so good. I turn on the faucet and I get free pork rib soup. So good. But this is the kind of humor that's going around in China as well. Well, so what's the point? I mean, so what am I describing? What am I in the I'm in the business of coming up with policies and policy ideas. But first, I think we have to understand the problem better. And I think this gets a little bit closer to the problem. We're not dealing with one China. We're dealing with three Chinas. We have a policy for one China. We have a policy for that modern China. And that policy has a mix of trying to bring them more from modern to postmodern, a little bit less competitive with us, a little bit more cooperative with us. Policy has worked to a certain degree. There's a balance of power equation in all of this. We have great allies in the region. We project military power in the region. We try to keep the peace, and so on and so forth. We have no policy for what happens if things go very wrong in China and the pre-modern elements of China actually become more important and more dominant in China than the other elements of China. And so my job, I think, besides to describe how we should head off the worst excesses of modern China in terms of the great power politics, my job, I think, besides explaining the problem to all of you, is to get policymakers and others to really start to think imaginatively about how to plan for a China that's much, much worse off. And if we think we have a problem today with China, think of a problem with China that just can't solve its problems but still has all that military power and all those nuclear weapons and everything else. Think about a China that's in some kind of pre-revolutionary phase today. And if I didn't depress you enough with that, hopefully I'll depress you through Q&A.
Thank you very much, Dan. Let's end up where, let's start where you ended up. Do you think that China will go straight in economic prosperity, or do you think that there will be a real disconnect and China will be through another revolution like the Great Leap Forward or the Cultural Revolution, or just a big depression?
Well, here's what I know for sure, and that is that the China that we see today, that's on this linear progression for 30 years of 9% growth and bringing migrants into urban areas and getting more productivity out of that and export-led growth, that's over. They might be able to bring more migrants into the urban areas and so on, but there are no more export markets. Maybe they can find them in Latin America. Maybe they can find them in the Middle East. They're not going to find them in Europe, which is their biggest export market. They're not going to find them in the United States. Not only that, but their exports are getting less competitive. They're getting less competitive because of currency devaluations in places like Japan and South Korea and elsewhere, and their labor is getting more expensive. And they're letting their currency be more liberalized, I would say, too. So that economic model, I think that the top of the economic leadership knows that. I think they have taken steps such as this credit crunch and some of the liberalization on interest rates and so forth that shows that they know the problem and they want to reform the economy and they want to allocate capital better. But that's a very tough thing to do politically. Very tough thing to do politically, given the fact that so many party members and so many people in the elites right now have huge stakes in the economy. So I'm confident that there are economic leaders in China who know the problems. I think they'll face huge problems trying to reform the economy into a consumption-led economy.
Okay, but it's one thing going from 9% growth to 7% growth. It's another thing going from 9% growth to zero growth or from negative growth and to have a big upheaval. Is there a chance of a big upheaval?
There is definitely a chance of a big upheaval.
And how would we know about that? We know about the upheaval, but what are the early warning signs of that?
Well, they're here. I mean, the early warning signs are here. So the incidents of massive protests, violent protests, mostly over things like what we would say environmental, but that's kind of, they're not even in that stage of kind of elitism yet, where they don't talk about climate change. They talk about air quality and they talk about water quality for their kids and so forth. But those protests can get rather violent. And so can the protests involving the expropriation of land. That's a huge area of contestation in China. And it's basically local cadres with commercial developers who just take people's land to develop for their own, but you'll see huge protests on those issues. Protests pop up all over the place in China. It's just a question. We never know in foreign policy what leads to an Arab Spring. The Tunisian grocer or the Tunisian that started the Arab Spring. That you never know, as Mao would say, and I don't call Mao very often. As Mao would say, the fire, the light that lights the prairie fire. But there's so many indicators out there right now. So we ought to be paying attention to it right now.
Okay, I want to open it up for questions, but let me ask you one last question, and that is the general theory of those of us who believe strongly in free enterprise and everything was that you had to have political freedom to have economic freedom.
Yeah.
That you had to have political openness to have economic prosperity, okay? That you needed the information, you needed the government to be fair, you need the openness of the press so that you could write about corruption, you needed free enterprise, you needed just the things that Arthur told us about, a court system that's basically fair so that people take the contract seriously and you can sue people who do that. The last 30 years, China has done very well economically without any of that. So our theory must be wrong.
Yeah. Well, there's another theory, and as much as practical people of political affairs and so on hate to admit it, so much of our foreign policy is based on theories, right? So the other theory was, of course, modernization theory, which I think is our Asia policy is based on, some with good empirical evidence. Modernization theory is that economic growth comes first. I'm simplifying greatly. I don't mean to offend any social scientists in the audience. There probably aren't too many. Or you wouldn't be here in Aspen enjoying your summer. But the idea that was borne out in other places in East Asia that I know about, like Korea and like Taiwan, and to some extent Indonesia, to some extent, although that's a little bit more complicated. This third wave of democratization came when there was greater economic growth. The middle class wanted more participation in their affairs. They organized themselves, they pressed, and we pressed with them to change their authoritarian ways of government. That, I think, was our policy with respect to China, going back to Richard Nixon and his famous, we need to bring it into the family of nations article in 1968, 1969. I can't remember the exact date. But anyway, that was one theory. And I think it's more that theory hasn't panned out in the way that we thought. And so we ask our questions, why is that? I mean, there are a lot of people doing very well in China. There's a middle class. I mean, there's an upper middle class. Why aren't they asking for more participation? And part of that is because much of the middle class today remembers the Cultural Revolution. And they are afraid of change because they suffered under the Cultural Revolution. So they'll go with the devil you know, for now. But that's not everybody in China. And there are very brave people risking their lives and their family lives and so on. This Nobel Peace Prize winner, Liu Xiaobo, the famous empty chair in 2010. There are many others like him who say enough is enough. And then the other point, Ken, which is an important one, is that there are many Chinese in the middle class, friends of mine that I know, who think that, all right, we have all this materialism, but we have nothing to believe in. There's no ethical and moral values. Christianity, I think, by some statistics, is the fastest growing Christian population in the world. A lot of that's underground, but people are looking for something to believe in.
Good. Arthur, is Arthur with us here? I was going to call him up on that. Call him up, Crystal, and we'll have.
Caught him out of class.
Yeah. A question. Yeah. Steph?
You've given us a litany of all the sins that China has committed over the last 30 years. Can you give us one thing they did right? Just one.
I don't think I gave you a litany of sins. I mean, I talked about an entire China that is full of entrepreneurs and brimming with wealth and brimming with demand for enjoyment and consumer goods and that are rich and luxurious and have done that they've done a lot of things very, very right.
But Steph, I mean, to take a country of 1.4 billion people and to have it humming at 9% growth year after year for 30 years.
Yeah, I think if I didn't explain that,
that's a hell of an accomplishment.
If I didn't explain that, then I have a communication.
Arthur,
problem.
come on up here.
But the fact that today we're talking about, the fact that the Chinese international financial system, the Chinese financial system, now affects the entire world financial system, is in and of itself a huge achievement.
Okay, well, let's have just a few minutes of questions on happiness, on AEI, on the financial crisis, on China, on anything you want. Okay, yeah, please. Oh, right over there. Yep, Dave.
I always find the visitation of the American Enterprise Institute in Aspen wonderful.
Good.
I just don't understand why the sponsoring organization, the wonderful Aspen Institute, doesn't integrate the conversation between the normal aspects of programs throughout July into August. It seems to be, I don't want to appear critical, but it seems to me that the more liberal ideas that might be more Brookings Institute or the American Communist Party or something in between seems to get
one of those
somewhere in that spectrum. There seems to be programming where several people on a panel are really not that different, and that the ideas and concepts of self-fulfillment, of community, of family, the subjects that Mr. Brooks talks about so enchantingly, for lack of a better phrase, never gets integrated on a panel, that there's a separation, separate but equal. Why is that?
We'll
And
take
what
that
can we
under
do?
advisement. I think that's a very good point. And thank you for having the courage to say it. I think it's great on that. All right, there was a question right over here. Yeah, please.
My name is Austin Sullivan, and the question is for you, Mr. Brooks.
All right, ask your question with the mic right there.
Okay.
Yep.
We obviously have a very substantial government-financed social safety system, the safety network. A good deal of which is certainly necessary, and much of which is politically bulletproof. Given your emphasis on earned success, what policy objectives does AEI, what are you seeking in the way of policy for the social safety network?
That's a good question, and thank you for that. One of the things that we know uncontroversially about poverty, I mean, this spans basically everyone of I think mainstream conscience in the United States, Democrat or Republican, liberal or conservative, is that poor people need two things: relief and opportunity. That's what poor people need. What we're really worried about is trying to find the boundary between relief and opportunity. The whole idea that, and this is, I think the way that I was able to organize my thinking on this was, this was a personal experience where, and I mentioned I'm from Seattle, Washington. I'm from a very left-wing family in Seattle, Washington, which it's, you can imagine, Thanksgiving dinner for me is super fun, as you can imagine. And I was having a typical blowout discussion a couple of years ago about the financial crisis, and one after another in my family they were talking about how it was the rapacious bankers and it was Wall Street and it was capitalism was falling apart, etc. And they said, "What do you think?" Because they're they love me, but they know what I think and they don't really want to know. But they what do you think? And I said, "Look, you guys, the problem is not too much free enterprise. The problem is not enough free enterprise. We had crony capitalism and overweening bureaucratic statism that conspired against the ordinary people in this country. That's what the story of the financial crisis is. We need real free enterprise, which would be fair and help people, right? And that's what we need." And someone I'm really close to in my family who doesn't agree with me on anything said, "I hear you. You always say the same thing, but I was just reading an article in the Seattle Times about this little girl who lives with her mother in a car. What's your precious free enterprise system gonna do for her?" And I lost the argument. I mean, I'm the president of the American Enterprise Institute, and she edits a website or something, and I lost a big policy argument about poverty. And later I was angry about it. I was talking to my wife, and I said, it's just not right. I don't understand these people. These people are my family. And I said, I got all the facts. I got all the facts, and she's got some sob story about a little girl living with her mother. It's an anecdote. And my wife said, "No, you don't understand. You deserve to lose that argument." So what do you mean? She said, "What do you care more about, money or people?" And I said, "Well, people." She said, "Why don't you start fighting for people instead of fighting for the free enterprise system? Is it really worth fighting for the free enterprise system if you're not pointing out how it helps people?" She's completely right. That's what turned me around. That's what changed the work that I do. What am I doing to fight for people? And the truth of the matter is that our system owes poor people opportunity and relief. Friedrich Hayek, the most notable economist who's iconic on the political right, said that the job of government is to do two things in a civilized society that's affluent. Number one is to actually create a safety net for the truly indigent. The second is to sort out market failures. What he's saying here, the most important conservative economist of the 20th century, is saying that poor people deserve a government safety net, and we can afford it in a free market economy. And second, that markets don't always work. Radical stuff. Radical stuff. It's true. I completely agree with that. The problem that we have in America today is that we have a safety net that extends all the way through indigents, all the way up into the middle class, all the way through corporate cronies and to the rich. And that's the reason we're going bust. And the cost of that, my friends, the cost of not fixing entitlements, the cost of not dealing with Social Security and Medicare, because a person who's retiring today in the middle class will take 3 times more out of the Medicare system than he or she ever paid in. The cost of that policy is that we will have insolvency like the periphery economies of Europe. As sure as I'm sitting here and so are you, we will see insolvency unless we change that. And the cost of insolvency will be austerity, and the cost of austerity will be borne by the poor. That is a fact. I know that's a fact because I lived in Spain. 22 years ago when I was married in Spain, there was no homelessness, virtually no homelessness. Today there's a homeless guy living on the stoop of my house in Barcelona. What happened? The financial crisis happened that led to insolvency, which led to austerity. Rich people in Spain are not paying the price. And all of us here will not pay the price for austerity in America either. Poor people will. We will not be able to afford the morally required safety net for the truly indigent unless we have the courage, unless we have the love in our hearts to be able to say we cannot afford and we should not afford a safety net for everybody else. That's
Very
the
good.
basic outline of my answer.
Thank you, Arthur. Let me ask Dan and take off on this question, Dan. In a general way, not just on the safety net, but is there any public policy in China that you think to yourself, boy, that's a great policy. We could we should model ourselves after it? Are they leading the way in any kind of realm of public policy that you admire? Thank you, Dan. Moving right along.
Let me say this.
All right.
Let me say this.
I'll let you say it. I asked you a question.
Yeah.
This is really the first time that an AEI scholar's been rendered speechless.
Right. I'm not speechless. I'm just trying to be polite, so perhaps the Aspen Institute will include us in the future. But by the way, many of my colleagues who do get involved in the Aspen Ideas Festival share not all the prescriptions, but share some of the diagnosis on China. But let me say this. Look, the Chinese are incredibly enterprising people. I mean, and maybe this just speaks to not some Chinese cultural policy, but this just speaks to what really happened in China to help build an enormous amount of economic growth and pull people out of poverty, and so on and so forth. A lot of the myth out there propagated both by the top levels of the Chinese Communist Party as well as some of their friends, being impolite, but some of their friends in the United States is that this all happened because Deng Xiaoping sat down one day and said, I'm going to open up and reform the economy. That's not what happened. What happened is in the 1980s, rural people decided to take their own action and decided to make agriculture more productive and decided to sell their surpluses. And Deng Xiaoping ratified that because it was working. That's fine. Deng Xiaoping was, in that sense, a very good man. But the entrepreneurs that we meet and have pulled them. So Jack Ma, right, the guy who is about to do the biggest IPO for an internet company, perhaps the biggest in history, rose from nothing. He did this in China. He did this despite the rapaciousness of the Communist Party, despite the fact that he has no connections in the party system. He did this on his own wit, on his own strength. So in many ways, the people that have really succeeded in China, have done so with a deck of cards stacked against them, harder than people here that come from nothing. So I won't say the public policies, except maybe the ratification of certain things that were going on anyway. I will say the people themselves. I say we have no quarrel whatsoever with the people themselves. We have a quarrel with the authoritarianism. We have a quarrel with conflicting interests. But I think once unleashed, they'll be natural friends and allies of the United States.
Mm-hmm. It is remarkable that the only poor Chinese are in China. Yeah. And every Chinese who gets out there. And they said during the Cold War years, I loved it, that communism was so strong that it could even make, in East Germany, Germans and Chinese unproductive.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, that was an incredible ideology that could make them
What you're saying is so true. And if you go to the economies that are booming in Vietnam and in Southeast Asia in general, Chinese were the ones that have been the first to really dominate the entrepreneurial classes. So absolutely. I mean, this is not a cultural thing. This is a system.
Okay, we said we were going to end at 11:10, and we are. Give us the last thoughts, Dan, that you have on when we walk out, what we should know and understand about China that's above all else, what's the big idea. And then Arthur, give us, that's kind of a description. Arthur, give us a prescription of how we can be happy for the rest of the week. Okay? Go on, Dan.
So I will depress you, and I want to get the clap lines that he gets, though. We want the Chinese to be happy, right? But we want let me be less flip here. The big idea is that, so you'll take a bunch of China specialists and they'll say, what's going on in China? And the people who focus on the economy or the one-child policy or demographics will say, China is a mess. China is about to be revolutionary. I mean, we are in French Revolution territory here. Everyone read Tocqueville, Old Regime, which the Chinese government told the people to do, because that's where it's headed. The people who are focused, I just came from a security military strategy conference in San Diego. They will say, China is eating our lunch. China is just so strategic. China is so clever. It has so much more military capacity in the Pacific than we have. The people in the financial markets that I talk to very often will say this, that, and the other. China, or AEI economists will say, China's doing fine. All it has to do is allocate capital better. Okay, all of these things are true, and I know that's a bit of a cop-out. But in a country of 1.2 billion people, in which one of the greatest sinologists ever, Lucian Pai, said, this is not really a country, this is a civilization pretending to be a country, all things can be true. And we need policies for all of those. And what I mean by that is we have a policy to help bring modern China into more postmodern China. We don't have any kinds of thinking, any kinds of imaginative ways of thinking of what comes next. If I could leave you with anything today, it's that what will be in China, what is in China today will not be in 5 years. I don't know exactly what that means, but it will not be the same.
Great. Okay, Arthur?
So I have to tell you something that's going to, it's an actionable assignment, so that you can have a happier week, so that you can finish, let's say finish it 1 week from now as happier people, okay? And if I do it myself, so will I. So it's gonna have something to do with work, but your work, your vocation, is not what you get paid to do necessarily. It's how you create value. So that's what I want to talk about real quick, okay? I told you I used to be a musician, and when I was a musician, I had a favorite composer. And my favorite composer was the same composer that many of you hold as your favorite composer, because he's actually the greatest composer who ever lived. It's Johann Sebastian Bach, my favorite composer, okay? Great composer. Now, Bach didn't innovate at all. Bach simply did the high Baroque better than anybody. He didn't invent the vernacular. He was productive, and he was aesthetically right, and he was technically excellent. He was also so fruitful that he wrote a cantata for every year in the church calendar. At the same time, he had 20 children. That's fruitfulness, right? 20 children. So you think he had 3. I mean, I got 3.
Wasn't
we think
he
it's
tired?
a nightmare, right?
Wasn't he tired during the day?
You'd think. One would think. That's actually his wife was tired. So Bach was a strict Lutheran. And Bach was once asked, why do you write music? Okay, that's a weird question. If I went to any one of you and I said, what do you do? And you tell me kind of what you do daily or what you've dedicated yourself to, and I say, why, right? What would you say? Here's the assignment. Come up with an answer why you do what you do. My whole talk today was about why we do what we do at AEI. Our mission statement is not what we do. It's why. It's to create a better life for more people. That's why. I can tell you about the what. China. Yemen, the economy, tax policy, health, education, full service stuff. Why do you do what you do? Bach said this. When he was asked, why do you write music? He said, I write music for the glory of God and for the enjoyment of man. That's why he wrote music. Now, that's not necessarily your mission, but could you do any better than that? To be able to come up with the answer to say, I write music, I live my life, I do my job, my vocation is dedicated to the glory of God and the enjoyment of man. Here's the assignment. Why do you do what you do? What's the why of your life? What's the mission of your vocation? I guarantee you this. If you come up with an answer that's not what, that's not how, but why, you'll be happier 1 week from today.
There's a wonderful, wonderful story just in that line, Arthur, of somebody going up and seeing people who are cutting stones and asks the first person, what are you doing? She says, I'm cutting stones here. Can't you see what I'm doing? Asks the second person, what are you doing? He says, I'm part of a team and we're making a cathedral. And there's a fundamental difference in the two answers of that, and that gets to very much your distinction of the what and the why. Let me thank our panelists right here and just tell you it's been a terrific morning.
Thank you.
Thank you.